So those are some of the obvious issues, frankly, that are raised and which have, I think, to some degree, clear room for improvement in the planning process. There's also procurement. And that's probably a much larger question, just because you move from planning, which tends to be a more academic exercise about identifying your needs, to a process where you're actually talking about investing dollars in building power plants. With respect to procurement, I think administrative agencies in general have heard the message, or should have heard the message, that they need to work with industry. And the criticism of regulation in the utilities sector has been that it is, to some degree, overly judicial and subject to a lot of after-the-fact second-guessing, rather than setting expectations up front and monitoring processes like planning and procurement. There are a lot of examples in the history of the Montana Public Service Commission where the utility thought it was doing what it was expected of it, and then when they filed an application with the PSC and the application was processed, they found millions and millions of dollars they had spent disallowed. That might be good for consumers in the short run, but it also undermines confidence in the utility on the part of investors, which ends up raising borrowing costs in the long run, and I would submit actually ends up hurting consumers. But that kind of after-the-fact armchair quarterbacking approach is the status quo, and it perhaps does fit an older model of regulation when, for instance, utilities were the deciders of acquisitions they wished to make. That is still true of MDU, for instance, which, if it thinks it wants to build a power plant, it doesn't ask us pretty please, it just goes out and does it. And then it submits a rate case, maybe years down the road, asking for recovery of costs. That's not true, however, of Northwestern Energy. And I think pre-approval of generating resources in particular, and I think it's spelled out relatively clearly in HB 25 too, seems to imply that there should be some greater amount of commission knowledge and buy-in to the planning and procurement process that leads to the selection of those resources. One of the foundational questions of any procurement process is it sufficiently competitive and transparent to be trustworthy? One example is, I think, usually a request for information or request for proposals is put out by a utility. One of the possibility of inserting a new rule is creating a comment period for those RFPs, allowing the commission, potential bidders, other parties of interest to say, we don't know that you really need this resource, or we think this part of the RFP is in error, we think you should edit this sentence, what have you. I think this, and ultimately, however, it would be, I think, as imagined, certain state commissions in our review of administrative rules of various states actually require an RFP to be submitted to the Commission, and then the Commission approves the issuance of the RFP. I think that is frankly going overboard and eats into the managerial flexibility of the utility, but the utility should have an option to at least hear comments on RFPs it issues. And this process, I think, could probably obviate certain problems with RFPs. Frankly, I think the current RFP that Northwestern has issued for community renewable energy resources is in some respects problematic. But there's been no process for the Commission or for me to be able to offer comments to Northwestern about the ways in which the RFP could be problematic. So Northwestern will simply have to remain in the dark about concerns that I have until and unless they offer a resource resulting from that RFP to the Commission for pre-approval, in which case 9 months or a year down the road, they might find out what the Commission as a group thinks about it. I find that problematic, and I don't think it helps industry. It doesn't help consumers. It doesn't help the transparency of the process. Another potential mode for improvement, I think, is in some kind of monitoring of bidding and scoring processes within the procurement, just to make sure everyone's level and square and being treated fairly. There's another foundational question. When I talk about procurement processes, I mainly refer to the type of resource like that 300 megawatt facility that would be built anew. or some other RFP that's asking for entirely new resources to meet a need that Northwestern has identified. But we want to make sure in the administrative rules as well that the utility does have the flexibility that it needs to acquire resources that unexpectedly come onto the market. And you probably are all aware of certain of those resources. There are at least 2 power plants connected to independent merchants or a wholesale co-op that are in bankruptcy, one in Hardin and one outside of Great Falls. There's another generating facility that has changed ownership recently, a hydro facility in western Montana. If suddenly, for whatever reason, a resource came onto the market, and rather than Northwestern being in the position of being able to be driver of the bus, being able to set up an RFP process, the seller of an existing generating station said, no, we're not going to submit a plant to an RFP process. We're going to, say, auction it off ourselves or sell it in a fire sale through a bankruptcy. I think it's reasonable to expect the utility to be able to have the flexibility of not necessarily doing something within the shackles of an RFP process. But in that case, the burden of proof, I think, naturally increases on the utility to explain to us why it thinks that's a good purchase. There's another problem as well regarding pre-approval applications to the PSC, and that is, quite frankly, the lack of technical expertise on the Commission to evaluate the usefulness, efficiency, and engineering of new or existing generating resources. And I do worry that there's always a knowledge deficit on the Commission when compared with a utility that has many times the staff capability of the Commission. And I mean, by way of example, we simply do not employ specifically an engineer whose job it is to sit around and wait for a pre-approval application to roll in on a pre-existing resource, who then can go out into the field and check up on the resource and do due diligence. So there's simply no in-house expertise to do that. The law clearly allows us to hire both an independent monitor and an engineer for the procurement and acquisition process. That's as a result of HB 25 in 69-8-421 sub 10 allows us to retain consultants in connection with the planning and pre-approval process. But really we have relatively, we really have not well implemented that part of the law in rules. We haven't described how the Commission should go about doing this, and in what situations where the law allows us to do it, we should go forward. Some could say, I think it's helpful to potentially have a rule that outlines the appropriateness of situations where this could happen. Although on the other hand, I suppose we could just call a work session at the PSC tomorrow and use our statutory authority to hire whomever we wanted. But I think it's better to try to lay it out and again set expectations up front if we were going to go down that path. Another thing that I hope can be studied in any kind of procurement rules review is this question of qualifying facilities and small independent generators. Right now, QFs enjoy something that's called the QF put. QFs do not have to, if they're under 10 megawatts, participate in a competitive solicitation process. They're treated unlike, in that respect, really any other electricity generating resource in the portfolio. Should QFs be reformed by limiting the standard offer, which is currently 10 megawatts of nameplate capacity, to some sort of smaller number like 1 or 2 megawatts, and then expect those small generators to compete in competitive solicitations if they're any larger than that? Obviously, there's people on both sides of that issue. There's people who would like to see them compete in competitive solicitations exclusively. There's other people, perhaps like the developers of hydro projects, that don't want to wait around for a competitive solicitation process to begin in order to have an opportunity to buy into the market with a relatively small slice of generation compared to the total need of Northwestern Energy. I can see it both ways. Another argument, I suppose, that the QFs would make would be prohibitive transaction costs. It does cost money to compete in a competitive solicitation, but of course the argument against that would be everyone else has to do it too, and so should you. So it's still very much up in the air. I've just intended to highlight a few of the issues that are being discussed in our previous panel, our previous two panels. There's been an enormous opportunity for the utility and others to have input in this process already. There will continue to be those opportunities, and I would certainly welcome any legislators who show interest in submitting their thoughts as well on this. Our consultants are going to have a final report. I believe NERIC's due date to us is the middle of September, maybe September 17th, rings a bell. And at that point, I expect their work product will be a kind of redlined version of administrative rules that we have and a kind of narrative form that explains why they think changes are warranted, whether they're deletions or additions. So we've shared our work product so far with the committee. I understand this is the Interim Committee's last meeting, but we will be sure to share any work products with the Senate and House Energy Committees as they become available. And that, I think, is all I have for the committee. Always happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kavulla.